Hi, everyone. Welcome to the only LCFS session of North American Carbon World. We know you had a lot of session options during this time, so we appreciate you coming out to this one. My name is Matt Lithgow. I'm head of Americas at Carbon Pulse. We are an online subscription-based news organization that reports on environmental commodity markets and climate change policy. I oversee coverage of all of our North and South American carbon market and clean fuel related articles and intelligence. Very happy to be here. Very happy to be joined by a great panel that will provide a lot of expertise and insight on current developments within California's low carbon fuel standard, as well as some of the other programs across North America, emerging programs coming online, interactions with the federal renewable fuel standard, and other sorts of complementary efforts there. So shaping up to be a good session. Before we get started, just a couple of things. I'll let my panel introduce themselves as well here in a second. But we'll have time for audience Q&A throughout. So if you have some questions based on what our panelists say here, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you involved. We want to make this an interactive discussion. And before we get started here, just a quick two-question survey here. LCFS not necessarily the main focus of this conference, so we just want to kind of gauge everybody's expertise or knowledge. So just a quick show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the low carbon fuel standard, know what it's about, etc.? All right, you're all rock stars, so that's good. So the second question then, of the people that know about it, how many of you would say that you are very familiar with the program? You know kind of you know what the regulations are about, you know program dynamics, you know market pricing, that sort of thing. Okay, so maybe about a quarter of that amount. But that's great. That'll help everyone frame their discussions and insight more properly then. So before we get started, I just want to maybe give my panelists a chance to introduce themselves here and talk about what you do, and then we can get started.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Matthew Botill. I'm a division chief at the California Air Resources Board, and I oversee our long-term climate change planning efforts and regulations. So I'm responsible for the state's 2022 climate change scoping plan. I also oversee the low carbon fuel standard.
Hi, I'm Sam Wade with the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. We're the national trade association for the RNG industry. We have over 350 members. We represent 98% of the pipeline interconnected RNG capacity in the U.S. And we're big proponents of the LCFS, strong supporters of it, trying to see it adopted in other states as well.
Hi, good morning. Josh Bledsoe with Latham and Watkins. I'm a lawyer. I do energy transition work and focus quite a bit on the carbon markets, including the low carbon fuel standard.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. And I think before we get into some of the current issues, developments, et cetera, going on with California's program and others throughout the country and the continent, I think we'll turn it over here to Matt B. to give a bit of an overview on what's happening right now with ARB in regards to the LCFS, future rulemaking, scoping plan, how that all intersects with it. So Matt, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for having me. So I'm going to just do a little bit of a backtread here on what a momentous year we had in California on climate policy. And I know our Chair Randolph, was here giving the keynote yesterday, and our executive officer, Steve Cliff, was also part of a panel. I've been with the Air Board now for 15 years, and I started when the climate change programs were really in their infancy in 2007, and started working really closely, in fact, with Sam at the time, on building up the cap and trade program right at the onset of the passage of AB 32, our first real significant climate change legislation here in California. And through that time, what we focused to do was build regulations that could hit our climate targets that the legislature passed and that we identified in our scoping plan processes back then. And last year, we had another significant year in California on climate legislation and on climate planning. So many of you may be familiar, but in September, the legislature and the governor signed bills, one of them, AB 1279, that codify the state's objective to get to carbon neutrality by 2045. That's huge. We've got a long-term objective now for California in statute, and in 1279, also a recognition that CARB is going to continue to develop and implement policies that get us to those long-term climate targets. The governor also weighed in during the scoping plan process to reinforce the role of programs like the low carbon fuel standard in helping us get to that carbon neutrality endpoint. And so we spent a lot of time as part of the scoping plan process really charting a path, figuring out what does carbon neutrality look like for California? How do we get there? And what are the technologies, the fuel use needed to be able to achieve carbon neutrality? I heard there was a panel yesterday on CCS, it sounds like. Lots of discussion in the legislative session and in the scoping plan on technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, like carbon dioxide removal, and the importance of those in addition to clean the fuel pool to get us to carbon neutrality. So, the work that happened over the course of last year really sets the vision for the LCFS program and for CARB on climate over the next decade. And that is pivotal because it means that we can now take, as an agency, our regulations and our programs, and we can update them with this long-term vision in mind, knowing that we've got the backing of the state legislature and the analytics that were done in the scoping plan process. So we've started in 2019, and we continued to hold in 2020 and 2021 discussions on the LCFS. And when it became clear in 2022 that the governor was behind the need to reinforce and rely on the low carbon fuel standard, and it was clear through the scoping plan that we needed to see a significant transition in our transportation fuel pool to lower CI fuels, we started in earnest really releasing proposals and ideas on how we could update the low carbon fuel standard. So the first real significant workshop we held in November last year before the adoption of the scoping plan to highlight some potential ideas to updating the LCFS. That focus for us is how can we increase stringency on the LCFS by 2030 so that we can encourage investment and deployment of clean fuels in the transportation sector, but then also send long-term market signals for 2045 that the program will be around, it will be used to decarbonize the transportation fuel pool in California over the long haul. So in November, we held a workshop with some additional ideas on how we could accelerate the stringency of the program by 2030, as well as set long-term 2045 CI targets. And with that, what are some other policy considerations that we could make to the program that would align it with the objectives that were called for in the scoping plan? So we've been moving quickly as an air board to adopt other complementary regulations on the demand side for vehicles in terms of the light-duty vehicle space, 100% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2035, the heavy-duty and medium-heavy-duty space, where we're going to be considering regulations to set sales targets for the medium and heavy-duty space that get to 100% in the late 2030 timeframe. That's going to our board very soon. And those endpoints are backed up by the work that we did in the scoping plan in terms of where we need to be in the transportation space, both the technology and the fuels, to get to a carbon neutrality by 2045. And so we took that work and started to fold it into the updates to the LCFS that we want to consider. Have that initial workshop in November and then followed with another workshop just last month in February. And the focus has been and will continue to be how do we make the program more stringent through those 2030 CI target adjustments, long-term CI target setting for 2045, and alignment in the LCFS with various policy signals that come out of the scoping plan and also these vehicle regs that we're pushing forward to make sure that as we decarbonize the transportation fleet, we set regs that create that demand for low CI and zero emission technology, that the fuel and the energy is there to back it up. We are very much in this conceptual stage yet. Right now, we haven't released a formal regulatory proposal. There's a 45-day package that goes out with any regulation where we release the reg text, we release the staff report with the information that supports the regulatory proposal. That is coming this summer, and when we release it, we're looking forward to all of your comments. Just last night, I was going through, I think, the 150 or so comments that we received on the February workshop, so I'm expecting lots of engagement on this as we move forward.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So there are a lot of moving parts to this forthcoming rulemaking, a lot of things that the ARB is considering to incorporate, and I'm wondering, Sam and Josh, from your perspectives, what are the major sticking points within this rulemaking that you think that people should know about? Things that you like, things that you don't like, improvements that could be made, suggestions. from your vantage points, based on the stakeholders that you represent, what do you see? What's important to take away from these?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. So I'll start. We represent the renewable natural gas space, which has grown dramatically in response to both the federal renewable fuel standard and state-level low-carbon fuel standards. So we're over 281 operational projects now across the country, and there's another 400 plus in construction or planning right now. The reason that there's been so much activity in the space in the last few years has been because of a few core things that the LCFS has allowed us to do. The first is really to receive full recognition of the true environmental benefits of renewable natural gas projects, many of which significantly reduce methane emissions. And that recognition of the full life cycle carbon intensity benefits of RNG has been key to the program providing enough value to motivate investors and to allow the economics of those projects to operate. On top of that, we've been able, and we've advocated for a long time, for a uniform North American market for renewable natural gas that layers on top of the market for conventional gas. And the California LCFS has been a pioneer in promoting that type of market that's led to development in-state and out-of-state in a fair and equal way. The in-state growth has actually outstripped the out-of-state growth, in part because of other supplemental programs like grant programs. But we've seen great success in promoting RNG growth in California and also supply from outside of California, serving the state's program and helping to drive down the carbon intensity of especially natural gas vehicles thus far. That's shifting a little bit in this proposal in a couple of different ways. And some of that we're very supportive of, some of it we're questioning a little bit, I would say. We're very supportive of the increased stringency and ambition that CARB is looking at. We believe targets beyond 30% by 2030 are very necessary. We believe that a step down in the near-term target to address, I don't want to call it oversupply, but the success of all low-carbon fuels that has led to a surplus of credits in the system. So that needs to be done as soon as possible to bring the market a little bit more back into balance and to hopefully restore credit pricing. Many of the projects that our members operate do need to see higher credit prices to be viable. And with both lower LCFS and lower RIN prices, it creates a challenging investment environment. So we're very supportive of increasing stringency, supportive of a near-term step down in the 2024 timeframe, and then supportive of an accelerator mechanism as well to address and prevent future oversupply situations. But the mechanics around that and the additional analytics that CARB needs to do to get that right, I think, are important to keep working on here. With respect to some of the proposed changes to the renewable natural gas provisions in the program, we do have some strong concerns, both with the idea of removing import eligibility when the RNG is used in natural gas vehicles. We think that's misguided and premature. Again, we're trying to make this work across the country and in a fair way, and it won't work if each state draws their own little boundary and tries to set up a balkanized market. And then with respect to just fully recognizing the environmental benefits of these projects for the lifetime of the project, we think it's appropriate to do that, especially on the methane avoidance side. Until there's requirements to control at places like dairies or a mandate to fully remove all material from landfills and put it somewhere else where it doesn't generate methane, these projects do generate real benefits. And I think because of some pressure from some anti-dairy groups or misguided NGOs, CARB is considering sunsetting avoiding methane crediting at some point, which would be extremely problematic to the economics of these projects. So I'll sort of pause there, but those are our issues right now.
Well, thanks, Sam and Matt. And Matt, thanks for the overview. I think it was really helpful. And if I may, I'll give a quick overview as well of the LCFS and then kind of go nerdy on some legal stuff and then jump to the market. So the way I typically explain the LCFS program, and I'm doing this because we have maybe 3/4 of the folks who are not deep in the program. The way you reduce emissions from the transportation sector, it's like a 3-legged stool, right? One leg being get people out of their cars, right? Public transit, walking, biking, micromobility. The second leg of that would be improve the vehicles, so miles per gallon, right? Make those better, or have a transition to zero emission vehicles, right? The third leg, and what the LCFS focuses on, is the carbon content of the fuel itself. So irrespective of the two other legs, the idea is if you reduce the carbon content, assume no changes in behavior, which is maybe a good thing to assume because we're all humans, is you can still reduce the emissions in that sector. So in terms of the legal aspect of this, the rulemaking that CARB is about to embark upon formally, and of course they've been doing it informally for quite a while with workshops and stakeholder engagement and getting a lot of feedback from stakeholders, it's a really rigorous and difficult process to get through. And, we've seen this before with prior LCFS rulemakings and other rulemakings that CARB engages in. So it's a lot of work to respond to all the comments, put out all of the environmental and economic analyses to support the rulemaking. And so one thing that I can say in terms of, how the market will react is the folks that support the LCFS, that want to lend to low-carbon fuel production, projects, folks that want to, trade in the credits, is you want certainty. And so you want a strong rulemaking that's going to be done the right way so you don't have litigation disruption on the back end. So one thing that I can probably predict is someone's going to sue CARB, right? Probably multiple folks are going to sue CARB over the rulemaking because you can't make everybody happy. And so the trick is to have a really strong administrative record that CARB, I'm sure they're trying to build now and will be building throughout the rulemaking process. We've seen litigation disruptions previously. So if we had a chart up there of LCFS prices over time, there are two big dips that you'll see, not including the most recent dip, which is really an oversupply issue. The prior dips had nothing to do with market fundamentals. They really dealt with litigation attacks on the program, and folks were literally worried, will the program survive? Does CARB have the authority to even implement this program? And so this is where, my 2 cents that I would, give to CARB, which is build a strong record, have certainty, and try to avoid that disruption on the back end. So I'm also have other aspects, substantively on the program, which I think, if I were king for a day, the things that I would do. So one, I would really try to adhere to, a neutral approach on technology, right? Not picking winners or losers. Now, some of this is not in CARB's control, right? CARB staff has their board that instructs them to do things. The legislature tells them to do things. But I think as close as you can keep it to technology neutral, the better. And the reason I say that is no one's ever going to pick these technologies correctly. No matter how much analysis is done, no matter how many modeling studies are done. An example is the history of the LCFS program itself. So early on, folks expected, gasoline replacements, ethanol, electricity, things like that to carry the day in terms of credit generation. That's not what happened at all. It was really the diesel replacement fuels that carried the day and built up the big credit bank and really kept the program going. And so that was something that no one had predicted. And so my theory is that we're not going to be able to predict what's going to happen over the next 10 years of the program. And so I think that technologically neutral approach is really helpful for fuel developers and for capital providers to those fuel production facilities. So that would be sort of my initial and overarching sort of theme for what I would like to see in the rulemaking. The second thing is go big or go home. So I think that we clearly have a climate crisis. Every time the IPCC puts out a new report or study, they're just trying to say the same thing in a different way, in a more urgent way, which is we have to sprint now. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so I think the idea here is we should go really big on the carbon intensity targets. In that way, it sort of can lower the temperature on some of these other debates, which we'll get into today, and Sam already previewed a bit on the RNG side. So, I would encourage CARB to go big and aggressive on the reduction targets. Because, we have a price ceiling to protect against adverse market impacts there. We may have a price floor, depending if CARB wants to include that in their proposal. And that, I'll stop.
Thank you. Just to pick up on a point that both Josh and Sam that you made, Josh, you talked about going big or going home. Sam, you mentioned, the step change, the acceleration mechanism. Just for everyone's knowledge, the current carbon intensity reduction target for the LCFS is 20% below 2010 levels by 2030. The ARB has released preliminary modeling scenarios of 25%, 30%, or 35% below 2010 levels by 2030. Just wondering, Sam and Josh, what target, do your stakeholders want to see from that? Is there a level of what's called the step change? So essentially ratcheting up or tightening next year's target, perhaps, when the implementation of these changes goes into effect from 2024? What kind of acceleration in the near-term target would you want to see? And then maybe a question for Matt here. There's a bill in the legislature right now in California that would ratchet up the California statutory greenhouse gas reduction target to 55% below 1990 levels by 2030, which is not only higher than the current statutory target of at least 40%, but is even greater than the 48% greenhouse gas reduction target in the modeling from the scoping plan that the ARB board approved back in December. So from your perspective then, how does that potentially getting passed play into what the ARB might do then with that increased ambition to 2030 target?
I'll take a first crack at that. So I like your comparison to the overall economy-wide goals, which are basically a 40% reduction right now below historical baseline by 2030. And that's for the economy as a whole. The transportation sector, as the largest sector, still needs to be contributing a good share of that. So I think even a 30% target is not fast enough. And many of the clean fuel voices in California have begun to collaborate together on some analytics around this for CARB's review. And the initial results we're seeing is that targets on the order of 35% or maybe even higher are feasible if you keep all options on the table and you remain technology neutral, as Josh was pointing to. So that's certainly what we would support. We believe that additional analysis around that will prove out that it is feasible. We thank CARB for releasing the results at the February workshop of one scenario. We'd like to see the results of the other scenarios too. And as of the ones that you've teed up, I think the scenario with the 35% target is obviously what we think is most appropriate, given that the fuels are there, right? The low-carbon fuel industry has responded dramatically to the signals California has sent historically, and we're ready to keep going if properly incentivized.
Yeah, I guess I should start with a caveat, which I have no stakeholders, right? I have multiple clients that have varied interests in the LCFS program. I have folks on the compliance side where they have to, they're generating deficits and need the credits to comply. I have folks on the low carbon fuel production side. We have lenders, to actually both of those other categories of clients. So, when I'm expressing these views, there's no subliminal messaging here. This is sort of just my personal view on, how I think the program would run most efficiently. But, personally, I do think a more aggressive target would be helpful because it again, when I said lower the temperature in some of these other issues, I think it can, address some of the concerns really from, the very legitimate concerns environmental justice groups have, very legitimate concerns that low carbon fuel producers have, including, the RNG Coalition members, if we had just a more aggressive target, because that kind of a rising tide lifts all boats, right? The idea that we can still achieve the targets that we need under the scoping plan without, some of these finer distinctions that, could, I hate to say it, lead to challenges to the program or challenges to the rulemaking, right? So the idea that maybe we can have a little bit of reconciliation before we get to that stage. So that would be sort of my personal view on it. And obviously I'm treading carefully because all of my clients are listening. But they have varied interests, and so I can address those later if you like, Matt.
So I'm going to answer Matt's question over here, and unlike Josh, I have no clients but many stakeholders. I still need to tread carefully on what I say, though. So in terms of 2030. And I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about the legislature this year and the scoping plan. 2030 has always been a midterm target. Josh referenced this and, what the IPCC tells us we need to do. California, the nation, the world, we need to get to carbon neutrality to stave off the worst effects of climate change. And so when I see things like, is it 55%, is it 40%, what is the target for 2030, I think, does it matter as much as getting to that endpoint that we need, that long-term trajectory that we need? And, to one of the points that Josh made as well, that, I don't agree with everything he said, but one of the things he said about certainty on the program. What we're trying to do with this rulemaking that we're embarking on is provide that long-term signal to get us to that 2045 point, knowing that there are going to be adjustments along the way. We're not going to get it right on every technology, every policy that we need to deploy. But, that's the regulatory process. And if we can tell the market, we can tell all of you that this program is going to exist, it's going to go out to 2045, it's going to have a significant strengthening that will happen, an opportunity potentially for a ratcheting mechanism or a step-down change early on to encourage early investment, and that will build the fueling infrastructure for our transportation system to get us there. That's what we're going to do. And so, if the legislature passes a bill that comes in and says 55% by 2030, we go back and we do our rulemakings. That's how it's always worked, right? What we said in the scoping plan was if we can implement the things that are being called for, and some of that stuff is already underway right now, right? In terms of the light-duty vehicle regulations or the medium and heavy-duty vehicle regulations, work on the renewable electricity standard, and LCFS and other regs that are going to come forward. If we're successful in implementing those things, we should be able to get to at least 48% reduction by 2030. So, are we splitting hairs here? Maybe. The long-term objective is the important one.
Got it. Thanks, everyone. And my apologies to Josh. That was my poor attempt at a catch-all term to cover everyone. So I will do better for next year. I feel like we could talk about California until the cows come home. There's so many different moaning. No?
No, cows come home.
Got to keep the cows in California. Got to have a strong dairy industry in California.
But, California was the only game in town for a little bit, but now we have several LCFS-type programs throughout North America. We have Oregon's program, which has been around since, compliance obligations started in 2016. You have British Columbia, which has been around for roughly the same amount of time as the California LCFS. And as of this year, we have a program in Washington State. And starting July 1st, Canada will be having a federal clean fuel regulation as well. So those aren't the only ones, though. Potentially. There's other states in the U.S. that are considering such programs as well. And I'm just wondering if some of the panelists can potentially provide an update on successes with these state-level bills trying to get LCFS programs implemented, perhaps some more recent difficulties in doing so. And from all of your perspectives, and this can include you, Matt, as well, from CARB success in implementing the LCFS, what is necessary in order to get these programs across the finish line? Because, Washington has launched their program as of this year. I think that took 4 instances in the legislature, maybe 5, until that got over the finish line in 2021. Several bills that were on the docket this year have gone for several legislative sessions, but have still not gotten over the finish line. So just curious on your thoughts there about what's holding back passage of these programs and what is necessary to get them across the line moving forward.
I can start. So our coalition is involved in all of the state level activity around these types of policies, as well as a federal effort to discuss, a federal clean fuel standard at some point that would work well with the existing federal renewable fuel standard. My observation is that other states are beginning to take climate seriously, do want to explore proven models that can drive adoption of all low carbon fuels. And the California example is the best one out there. And that's why there's a total of 8 states that had legislation introduced this year around clean fuel standards. And the work around that is very interesting for me as a Californian. As I go to each state, you hear different things, right? You hear, in a more conservative state, strong concerns about what does this do to conventional fuel prices, and what does this do to support agriculture, or what's the relationship between ag and biofuel adoption? In a more liberal state like New York, you hear the same concerns you hear in California about, don't we just need primarily ZEV technologies, and isn't this a distraction? And so I think that hopefully speaks to the fact that this is a solution that could work for a large part of the country if those sort of edge problems can be addressed. And California historically had a great balance on many of those issues. With respect to biofuels, there was a robust investigation of things like indirect land use change, a very careful treatment of avoided methane crediting, saying that, if there is a requirement to control at some point, we'll phase that out. There was a careful balancing of those types of thorny issues, if you will, within the current regulatory framework. And then in this rulemaking, we've begun to go back and scratch at some of those delicate parts of the policy, and I think it risks undermining California leadership overall. What will work in a very liberal state like California will not work in the Midwest and will not work in New Mexico, for example. And we tried hard to make this policy a policy that was very exportable. I think we should keep trying to do that because many other states take California's vehicle standards and they can just kind of take it or leave it. That's it. That's the only thing they can do. With this policy, they can make it their own, but they need to have California leadership to show them that it's viable. And part of leadership on alt fuels is correctly addressing the agricultural overlay that many of those fuels touch on. So I'll pause there, but that's my observation thus far.
Yeah, I mean, if it's okay, Matt, I'll go next. So I think the first thing we should do is allow CARB to take somewhat of a victory lap. The fact that we even are answering this question shows that California has demonstrated, and CARB's demonstrated leadership in terms of building an LCFS program, right? And, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I think that's what we've seen in Oregon, see in Washington, see, the Canadian federal program. So I think that the construct is a really good one. The regulatory structure is really good. It's, very interesting structure in terms of how we're funding low-carbon fuel deployment. It's really funded by the average California motorist when you go to the station and pump your gas, right? And I think it's a smart policy as we think about how to fund basically climate and decarbonization action in the state. Now, I agree with Sam that it's hard to do these things in other states because the political dynamics are different, right? I would say that the exportability of the California policies I view as actually more important than the state reaching net zero, right? I mean, we could reach net zero and we still have a climate crisis. I think California's most important role is to have exportable policies and technologies and a demonstration that you can decarbonize without creating the economy, right? And I think we're actually on a really good path to do that. But I think allowing these policies to be not plug and play, but as close to that as possible, hopefully will still be a guiding, a lodestar for the state. But I say all that as if there were no restrictions on CARB. I mean, CARB has legislatively imposed mandates to achieve decarbonization by certain times, so they can't only focus on exportability. They also have to meet the mandates set on them by the legislature. So I want to echo a couple of things, and I'm going to disagree with Sam here a little bit. I'm going to echo a couple of things that Josh said and disagree with Sam here, and that is the idea that California is somehow absolving its leadership role. I think the exact opposite is true. I think we are so far in front on our climate policies. We've been doing this now for 15 years. We've got a number of climate regs, climate statutes that have been passed. We've had the political will in California and the technical competency to deliver on these programs to show that they work, to show over the last 5 years on LCFS in particular that we can use policies like the LCFS to really spin up a significant portion of low-carbon fuel supplies for California, that we are now entering a different stage on our programs. We're entering that long-term stage of how does this program exist into the climate objectives that we have for 2045, and what kind of adjustments can we make? And so to me, this is not a question of is the technology there, are the fuels there, are the frameworks for passing climate regs, do we still need to work on those? For California, we're there and we're past that. This is more of a question of can other jurisdictions stand up the political will to be able to adopt similar policies that get them moving on clean fuels and on greenhouse gas reduction measures. So, I think California has demonstrated that it is absolutely possible. But, and the folks on this panel know, not every jurisdiction is the same as California. They've got their own things to deal with on the politics side that they need to be able to manage, and that's going to take a coalition of the willing to make sure that those things get over the finish line.
I think it might help maybe a bit to also just contextualize the diversity of the states that are considering these clean fuel standard LCFS type bills. Sam, I know we were talking about this. Do you maybe want to provide a quick overview of which states are doing this? Because, for example, it's especially this year, it's been someone that's been covering carbon markets and clean fuel standards for about, over 5 years now. Some of the states that are, have tried to pass legislation are ones that, for example, would never touch a cap and trade program with a 10-foot pole. Like, it's, maybe doing things on the clean electricity side, but this is sort of a unique situation now where you're even seeing proposals from one particular party that is typically averse to significant climate change policy, right? So,
Yeah, that's correct. So here's my list, and, obviously these are the ones that we're actively engaged in. There's been other discussions in other states, but these are states that have had bills this year. It's New York, Minnesota, Illinois, Vermont, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and Michigan. And that is a very broad set of different stakeholders. The Pennsylvania bill, for example, was introduced very recently by Republican authors, which I think is a really important step to recognize that in that state, that is the party that will probably decide how things unfold. And so we have to be excited that this idea that came from California and came from originally a moderate Republican governor, and Governor Schwarzenegger, has been, it remains viable in the rest of the country. And that, in part, it's because it's proven to work, right? It has created benefits for some of the Midwestern states that produce a lot of the crop-derived biofuels. It has also increased ZEV penetration, so states that are very serious about ZEV adoption see this as an excellent complement to mandates on vehicle suppliers. And the fact that it does all those things is a tight wire, rope walker type of trick, right? And it's very important that we maintain that in California. We have to stay balanced, and we have to be willing to keep all those voices advocating for these types of policies in other states to make a difference on the U.S., and hopefully the world's greenhouse gas trajectory in the long run.
We've talked for the past several minutes anyways about other states adopting or trying to adopt programs similar to that of California. Last month, we had a federal hearing on a clean fuel standard take place in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. First time, to my knowledge, that that's ever taken place. And suddenly, LCFS is in the national spotlight. To the panelists, maybe to start with Josh, from from the legal perspective, is implementing an LCFS type policy possible at the federal level, through existing existing regulatory authority that EPA has under Clean Air Act or any other sort of mechanism there? Because, we have a divided Congress. IRA passed last year as major piece of climate legislation already. There's an election coming up next year already at the presidential level. I guess that's one part of the question. The second part, this can go out to Sam as well. What is the political will that you see to actually pass, an LCFS program, whether that's something separate from the renewable fuel standard, which I'm sure some people in the audience know about, but is also it's more along the lines of originally for energy security, right? The Energy Security Act of 2005 and then repassed in 2007. But as the regulation is concerned, looks a lot differently than LCFS does. So how would that work in terms of, amending the existing RFS, coexisting alongside of it, replacing it outright? Any of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll try to stick to the legal aspects. Sam's obviously, probably best position to answer the political aspects of it. I would say that the RFS regulation and the statutes that allowed the RFS regulation to be promulgated are actually surprisingly broad in the authority they grant EPA. I actually don't think EPA would do this, and I can explain why in a second, but they theoretically could try to revise the program to look a little bit more like a clean fuel standard program. And for everyone's benefit, the RFS program has these different buckets of fuels, the way they categorize the fuels, and they are tied to reductions in carbon intensity, but it's really a crude instrument compared to the LCFS, which makes very, very fine distinctions down to the gram of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. And so I think the RFS program is more properly viewed, at least originally, as an energy security bill, a farm bill, And now there's this really interesting political détente that's emerged where you have, red states that love it and red states that hate it, blue states that love it and blue states that hate it, right? And so that's kind of created this détente where the program is somehow durable, right? And EPA now has more authority to set the targets, kind of, divorced from what the statutory requirements were. And of course, like everyone else, Congress was way off in terms of predicting, cellulosic, fuel production. And so, they have to do these waivers and different things over the years. So I do think there is a potential path for EPA to explore to do it under their existing authority. I don't think they'll do it, one, because it would be a massive fight to do that. And two, we have a new U.S. Supreme Court, right? And we had the major questions doctrine that was raised in the West Virginia case versus EPA. And so this is the type of thing that I suspect a lot of conservative legal groups, even Republican attorney generals, would jump on and say, wait a second, really? EPA, you have authority to do this wide-ranging program? I don't think you do. And so that would likely that would be challenged almost immediately, and it could very well be like red meat for the Supreme Court probably to take that type of case. So I'll stop there. I'm sure Sam has a lot of thoughts on the legal and of course, the political aspects.
Yeah, I'll approach it more from the perspective of eventual legislative action. The Drive Clean initiative is the national effort to promote conversations about California-style clean fuel standard at the federal level that would layer on top of and complement the existing RFS incentives. There was a really good hearing last month in Senate EPW. I thought the testimony that was given by Air Liquide especially was really, really good. And RFA and others, also had a great summary of how it could work. There's a strong set of stakeholders who have, come together around the concept because they've seen the success of the California program, and they want to continue to promote it at the federal level. But of course, that is somewhat predicated on the state level program still working for everybody. There's over 50 groups involved, from automakers to farmers to utilities to obviously renewable fuel producers. It's a really exciting and dynamic set of stakeholders that I think can really take the concept pretty far, providing that they can continue to see that alignment across their interest. And our group is a small part of that, but we have had lots of conversations with EPA recently about their ERIN and SET package. And we support what they're doing at a high level on ERINs, but also see some pitfalls, and would love to see better alignment between CARB and the RFS on those incentives as well. So there are lots of big changes that their EPA is already making to the cellulosic portion of the RFS. And I think that can really be a strong thing for renewable gas in the long run, especially if California creates good alignment with those incentives. But that just kind of plays into the long-term need to talk about carbon as the primary driver of adopting renewable fuels, which is really what the Drive Clean initiative would do with the federal clean fuel standard.
Sure. Maybe one last question from me, and then we'll open it up, hopefully with 15 minutes left for the audience if you want to weigh in and ask some questions here. But Sam, you mentioned ERIN pathway. So for those that don't know, and the SET proposal as well. So back in November or December, the EPA published its SET proposal for essentially the next 3 years of blending quotas under the renewable fuel standard. And in addition to that, as part of this rulemaking package, they also proposed what's called this ERIN, so the electricity RIN, for renewable electricity from biogas to generate credits under the program under the D3 category, which, as Josh mentioned, was originally envisioned for cellulosic ethanol. That really didn't pan out to the EPA's expectation of what fuel volume would eventually be, but has been mostly filled since then by RNG, essentially biomethane. So, Matt, a question for you then is, how is ARB responding to these developments at the federal level? Are you, with ERIN, with SET, how does that get taken into consideration to the current or the forthcoming rulemaking, I should say? Any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, we're certainly monitoring the situation. The proposal isn't finalized yet, and so we're working with EPA, but also looking at our proposals and seeing how these complementary incentives could work for various different end uses on the fuels and what that would mean for delivery into California. So we're going to continue to keep an eye on it and work with EPA on this. I will say that, to some of our earlier points around the environmental benefits, to the extent that we're getting complementary policies that value the methane reductions that we need or the carbon reductions that we need, to Sam's point earlier, those are net positives. We need those policies to bring in more demand for things like biomethane into various different sectors and for low CI fuels. So obviously excited to see more development in this space, and we're going to keep working with EPA on it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I said, we're broadly supportive of the ERIN package, and the main ask we had in the SET proposal generally was just more ambition in the targets, because we think this is a chance to supercharge biogas or RNG development across the country, get the necessary methane reductions from the organic waste sector on an accelerated timescale. One thing we really think CARB should pay attention to in that package is the matching of where the biogas or RNG is produced to the electric vehicles and how that functions. There's a very clear framework that the EPA is laying out on how that should work, and if CARB would align with that, it would really allow us to stack those incentives, build lots of plants very quickly, and motivate a ton of methane reductions in the next decade or so. And when I say ton, I mean many tons, millions of tons. And so we're concerned that there hasn't been a strong dialogue between EPA and CARB on that issue yet. There's so many EVs in California. Our group is end-use agnostic, so we're supportive of RNG being used everywhere that conventional diesel or gas is used. And we want to displace all of that as quickly as we can, including in power generation, including as an input into electric vehicle batteries. So, if that's set up in a smart way across both these policies, it will happen quickly, and a lot of methane will be avoided, and a lot of good things will happen on the vehicle side as well. If it's not set up in a smart way, it will not work, right? And so those are the concerns that we have, and that we challenge CARB and EPA to get that alignment going and really motivate a lot of methane reductions quickly.
Yeah, I feel like I should unpack ERINs a bit for the audience, if that's okay. So the way it works today for renewable natural gas is if you clean up biogas to pipeline quality standard, it becomes RNG, and then you can inject it into a pipeline, and you can do what's called book and claim accounting. So you inject it in New York State, you take it out downtown Los Angeles for a Metro bus, and voila, you have an LCFS credit, right? But you can also get an RFS RIN for doing that activity, right? And it's actually a very valuable RIN. It's typically a D3 RIN. Unless it's food waste, and that's a different category and a little less valuable. But what had happened is you had this divergence of the California program and the federal program. The California program would allow you to take renewable natural gas and combust it or run it through a fuel cell and make electricity, and then route that electricity to electric vehicle charging, right? And there's very detailed rules laid out for how you track the electricity and who gets the credits and so on and so forth. But it only applied in the WEC, Western Electricity Coordinating Council jurisdiction. So if you had an RNG production facility and it was in the right geographic location, you could do this sort of electricity play and get both the RIN and get the LCFS credit. But you could not get a RIN, and you still can't get a RIN unless this ERIN proposal is finalized. And then it doesn't matter where you are, right? In terms of getting the ERIN, you could be on the East Coast and you could, charge an electric vehicle in New York City. And an ERIN would be generated, and so it's interesting that you have these different approaches to RNG, to electricity, to electric vehicle charging. And so anyway, I just thought that may be helpful to sort of unpack a little bit. It's a dramatic proposal, right? Because what it could do is for folks that are in the right geographic location, they could get both LCFS credits and get ERINs. And notably, because of how the math works with some of the equations in the LCFS, is actually typically more valuable. You get more credits for an LCFS to RNG to electricity pathway than just an RNG pathway. That's because of the inherent efficiencies of an electric motor versus combustion vehicles. And so a lot of stakeholders are tracking this really closely. The financing aspects are fascinating because the ERINs don't actually go to who you may think they would go to. They don't go to the RNG producer. They don't go to the electricity producer. They don't go to the charging station. No, they go to the automaker, right? So the automakers are thrilled, right? This is manna from heaven, right? There's massive incentive for the automakers, which in theory will supercharge electric vehicle deployment. So we could do literally an entire panel just on eRINs, I think. But it is a fascinating development and something that all of us are tracking closely.
Got it. All right. Thanks, everyone. We've got about 10 minutes here for questions. I don't want to hold up lunch because, as Tim Robinson says, and I think you should leave, you just can't skip lunch. Some people laughed, and I told that joke at our conference in London, and it absolutely bombed in front of 300 people, so I'm taking that as a victory. So questions. Yep, right here.
For Josh, you were speaking a little bit on car picking favorites on different pathways. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and speak to how it affects the viability of the program in your opinion?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it. So the question was, I mentioned picking winners or losers in the program and how that could affect the viability of the LCFS program moving forward. So, and again, some of this is outside of CARB's control, some of it's within their control. And Sam's already mentioned, maybe phasing out crediting for RNG over time, limits on crop-based biofuels, things like that. Some of those are actually more imposed by the board, imposed by the legislature. But an example would be capacity crediting for electric vehicles, right? The idea that you can have this high-speed charger, let's think the Tesla supercharger, and they can get credits just for being built regardless of whether anybody ever uses the charging station. So that's clearly a thumb on the scale for electrification, right? And, a few of those things are okay and are not going to, wreck the program. The problem is when folks look at deployment of $2 billion for a brand new renewable fuel production facility, and they look at CARB and say, can we trust the program's not going to change? What if our fuel is picked as the loser in the next rulemaking, right? So that consistency of the technology neutral approach is really important to making capital providers comfortable. And that's really what this program, in my view, is all about. It's motivating private capital to be deployed to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. So that's kind of unpacking a little bit why I think the technology neutral approach is so critical. It's really about what is the bank going to think the next time they look at the RFS and LCFS programs.
Yep, right here.
I noticed in the February workshop that setting a strong price signal, long-term price signal was mentioned multiple times. That was really crazy. Based on that, participating in the workshop, should price be a focus, and then we have a bank that's probably over 50 million by now.
Can you speak up? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last bit.
Is the focus right now on setting the targets or trying to set targets to hit a price?
Oh, okay. No, the focus is on setting the targets, right? And then looking at those targets and just, based on what we know today, what does that mean for the deployment of the fuels and the energy that we need for the transportation sector? So right now the focus is on setting those targets. There will be significant discussion about what does that potentially mean from a credit price perspective, because by law we have to do an economic analysis whenever we produce a rulemaking update. So we have to do that as part of the analysis, but the focus is on setting the CI reduction targets because that's what the program's about. Yeah, because we understand, too, that by setting an aggressive CI reduction target, the market will respond in terms of credit generation opportunities, and that comes from the ultimate credit price that gets generated from the strong targets. So the need for the fueling infrastructure and the response that the private sector provides in the program is derived primarily from the price of the credits that are traded on the market. I'm sorry, you're going to have to speak up. There's a lot.
The last year has been sort of lower credit prices for about a year now. The test prices historically. And we still have plenty of credit prices.
David, I think that's partly due to unprecedentedly high conventional fuel prices and emerging new federal support, right? Both the federal tax credits and RIN prices have been decent. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. That's been the recent trend. But anyway, I think CARB's right to look at both price and quantity and to understand the relationship between those things. I think the CATS tool needs to continuously be improved to get better at addressing those relationships.
Yeah, and then I'll just layer in here too that in many ways, the price of the credits reflects what the fuel supply looks like, to Sam's point, and the ability to generate low carbon fuels and bring them into the California market. And so when you see price fluctuations, it's not something that is a net negative on the program. If we're seeing overperformance in the program, we're seeing more low CI fuels coming into California, we see an opportunity to make the program stronger and to continue that momentum for low CI fuels to come into the state and not sit back and wait for that to happen in the future. So, this is a response, I think, to the rulemaking that we had in 2018, and the elimination of the previous litigation risk and people coming on board and producing those fuels. And we know, and we've heard this and seen this, that planning cycle, 2, 3, 4 years to bring those fuels online happens. And so in many ways, we're starting to see the effects now.
Jordan, bring us to lunch, maybe? Or one more. We'll do one more after that, but go ahead.
Yeah, so when we release the package, it goes for 45-day comment period. Planning to do that this summer. We're shooting for a board meeting late summer, early fall, so that we can still hit those dates that we've talked about in terms of getting it effective in early 2024, so that we can all, have the certainty of the program that I think everybody wants.
Right here.
So I'm going to try to loop in a topic that was at the last plenary session. It was mentioned that it was difficult to get companies and or individuals or even nations to accept and take on climate change because of the complexity and difficulty of participating in the system, or the systems that have been created. And I can attest as working for a voluntary utility participant in the LCFS program, our biggest issue has been the owner's reporting requirements in order to receive credits. On top of being dictated how our the credit revenue is spent, IICCFR. So my questions are, I guess, for Sam and Josh would be, have any of your clients experienced the same issues? And that is CARB looking for ways to make the program more friendly, I should say, so that way it can entice more broader participation and better export.
Sure. Yeah, let me take that one, and then I can hand it to my colleagues here on the panel. So, so a couple of things. One, from a California perspective, it is incredibly important that we maintain the rigor in our programs so that we maintain the public confidence and trust that the reductions that we're getting through these programs are happening and that we're making making progress towards our climate targets. And so that rigor comes through in how the staff and our third-party verifiers go through, every fuel pathway, the reporting, to make sure that we're solid. Are there opportunities to streamline the program? Absolutely. We've signaled an openness to identifying those as part of this upcoming rulemaking. There are things that we know that we can do around, Tier 2 versus Tier 1 pathways, around verification that we've put out that we hope will help make lives a little simpler for everyone, but still maintain that rigor that's important for the program, for the environmental integrity on the program.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough trade-off, but on the whole, we have to try and move toward greater simplicity so that other states can adopt these policies. But still rigorous verification, because, there was a recent Oregon issue on, fraudulent claims on EV-related stuff. So you can't fully take people's word for it. You have to trust but verify. The rules just need to be as simple as they can be, but still motivate the actions that the state's trying to motivate.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would answer yes. My client base, does have concerns and have had issues at times with making sure they're complying with the reporting and other aspects of the LCFS program, and it's just you need a dedicated effort to do that. The restrictions on spending the revenue from selling LCFS credits, that's also a really fascinating topic. I think it depends on your philosophy. I probably would weigh in on the side of saying I actually prefer fewer restrictions right? And then I think that would actually deploy more, let's say, electric vehicle charging stations, if there were sort of less restrictions. But you have the public utilities, investor-owned utilities, and there's that regulatory oversight by the Public Utilities Commission on the investor-owned utilities. And so, no matter almost what CARB does, the CPUC is always going to have some oversight, right, over what those utilities do. And then, of course, you want, in theory, some sort of equality and treatment, for all, utilities. So it's a legitimate concern. Totally sympathize with you on the reporting issues.
I'm told for lunch they are serving manna from heaven, so I'm going to let you all get off for that. But thank you to my panel here for great presentations. Thanks for everyone for joining.